$8,000. That's all that stood between me and an operating table. My son had just closed a business deal 1,500 times that size, and he still told me there wasn't a single dollar in the world he could spare for his own father. Sit with that number for a second, because nothing that happens next makes sense until you understand how small $8,000 was to him and how enormous it was to me. My name is Daniel Kirby. I'm 63 years old, a retired roofer living alone in a two-bedroom house in Palo Verde, Arizona, a few blocks off Camino Real. Close enough to Miller Park that on a still evening I can hear the announcer calling the ball games, if the wind's blowing the right way. It was a Thursday evening in June, the kind where the heat doesn't quit just because the sun went down. The rains hadn't broken yet that year, so everything outside my kitchen window looked the same as it had for 2 straight months, bone dry. The saguaros standing there like they were daring the sky to do something about it. I was at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee I'd let go cold, staring at a stack of mail I didn't feel like opening. A reminder from the power company, a card from my dentist, and underneath it all, a letter from my insurance provider that I already had a bad feeling about, because good news doesn't usually come in an envelope that thick. My phone rang. A video call, which my son almost never does unless he wants an audience. Marcus's face filled the screen before I even said hello, and behind him I could see a bar. Dark wood, string lights, somebody's arm reaching past him with a bottle. Dad, Dad, you will not believe the day I had. He didn't wait for me to answer. That's not new, that's just Marcus. We closed the Talon Ridge deal, 12 million. My name is on the closing memo, Dad. Marcus, that's incredible. And it was. Whatever's gone sideways between me and that boy over the years, I've never once wished him anything but good. Grant's throwing us a whole thing tonight. I gotta go, but I wanted you to be the first person I told. Somebody yelled his name behind him. He was already turning from the camera. Love you, Dad. Talk soon. The call ended before I could even ask what Talon Ridge was. Funny thing about that name, I'd hear it again in about 6 weeks, and it would mean something completely different to me than it meant to him. I sat there a minute, phone still warm in my hand, feeling something I wasn't proud of. Not jealousy exactly. More like standing outside a window watching your own family have a good time without you. I coughed, third or fourth time that hour. I'd had it going on 3 weeks by then, and I kept telling myself it was just the dry air. The dust kicked up before the rains finally broke something loose in the sky. My daughter didn't buy that excuse for 1 second. Claire showed up 2 nights later, carrying a foil pan of green chili stew, the kind our neighbor Marisol Vega had taught her to make years back. Claire's 29, works as a hospice nurse, and she has never once in her life let me get away with anything. You're still doing that, cough. She set the pan down without asking if she could come in, because in her mind she never needed to ask. It's the dust, baby. Aha. She crossed her arms, and in that moment she looked more like her mother than she ever had before. You're seeing Dr. Whitfield on Saturday. I already called and got you in. Claire. Don't argue with me, old man. I'll drive you there myself if I have to. I didn't argue. There's not a lot of point arguing with Claire once she's decided something. She gets that from somewhere, and I've got a strong suspicion it's me. We ate at the kitchen table, and for a while it was easy, the way it used to be before her mother passed. Before her brother moved away and started talking to me like I was a line item he had to manage instead of a father he loved. Claire told me about a patient she'd lost that week, an 81-year-old man named Arthur who used to whistle old radio jingles even in his last days, and how it broke her heart every time. No matter how many times it happened. How do you do that job? I asked her. Every day watching people go. Somebody's got to sit with them. Simple, like it wasn't the hardest thing in the world. Somebody's got to make sure nobody dies alone. I didn't know it yet, but in a few weeks that sentence was going to mean something to me I couldn't have imagined sitting at that table. Saturday came fast. Dr. Whitfield's office sits off Desert Boulevard, the kind of place with a fish tank in the waiting room and a receptionist who's worked there so long she remembers your name without checking the chart. He listened to my chest longer than a man wants his doctor listening to his chest. "I want to get imaging on this," he said, already writing before he'd finished the sentence. "Today, if we can." They squeezed me in for a scan that same afternoon. I sat in my truck in the parking lot after, a 2011 Silverado with 190,000 miles on it and an air conditioner that only worked if you begged it, and told myself it was probably nothing. The call came 4 days later. Dr. Whitfield's voice had a different weight to it. "Daniel, I don't want to alarm you, but I need you to come in Monday. We found a mass. I want to be straightforward. It's operable, and that's good news. But we need to move quickly. Weeks, not months." There it is, I thought, the other shoe. I sat in that parking lot a long time after I hung up, watching the heat shimmer off the asphalt, doing the kind of math a man does when he already knows the answer isn't the one he wants. I had savings, not much, maybe $2,100, the kind of money you tell yourself is for emergencies right up until the emergency shows up and laughs at how small it is. My credit wasn't what it used to be. Roofing does that to a man's knees and his bank account both. Monday's appointment confirmed what Saturday's scan had shown. A mass sitting where it had no business sitting, and a surgical team who wanted me on their schedule within 3 weeks. That's when a woman named Carla Jennings from billing came in, folder in hand, looking about as comfortable as a person can look delivering news like this. "Mr. Kirby, I want to walk you through your coverage. Your policy has a gap for the surgical approach Dr. Whitfield's recommending. There's an out-of-pocket deposit required before the surgical team will reserve an operating room date. How much are we talking?" $8,000. I know that's difficult. We offer a payment plan for the remainder once surgery's complete, but the deposit has to be paid up front. Hospital policy. $8,000. I had $2,100. I sat in my truck in that parking lot a second time that week and did the math about 6 different ways, and every time it landed in the same place. I told myself I wasn't going to call Marcus. I told myself that for 2 whole days, mostly out of pride, partly because some part of me already knew how it was going to go. Then I called him anyway, because that's what a father does. You swallow whatever's left of your pride and pick up the phone, and you hope, God you hope, that your boy is still in there somewhere underneath all that success. He picked up on the fourth ring, and I could hear it right away. Music, somebody laughing too loud, glasses clinking behind him. "Dad, hey, can this wait? We're still celebrating the Talon Ridge thing. Marcus, I need to talk to you about something serious." A pause, muffled sound, like he'd stepped somewhere quieter. "Okay, go." So I told him all of it. The mass, the surgery, the gap in my coverage, the $8,000 I needed within the week or they wouldn't schedule me. Silence on the other end, a long one. Long enough that for one stupid second, I let myself believe he was doing the same math I'd done in that parking lot, and he was about to say the words I needed to hear. "Dad," his voice had gone flat. "We just closed 12 million. You understand that's the fund's money, right? That's not sitting in my checking account. I've got a mortgage." He stopped, started again, colder. "There's no money for you, Dad. I wish there was, but there isn't." I've replayed that sentence more times than I can count. "There's no money for you, Dad." 6 words. I could recite them in my sleep. It's $8,000, son, not $800,000. You don't get it. Something sharp crept into his voice. "I spent my whole childhood watching you put every spare dollar back into that company instead of into this family. I'm not doing that math again. I'm not asking you to bail me out. I'm asking for help with surgery. I have to go, Dad." And he hung up. I sat at my kitchen table, holding a phone that had gone quiet. looking at that stack of mail, feeling something crack open in my chest that had nothing to do with the mass on the scan. I want to be fair, because fair matters to me even now. Marcus wasn't always like this. There was a version of my son who used to ride in my truck on Saturday mornings, who used to hand me nails while I worked a roof line, who used to think I hung the moon. I don't know exactly when that boy left and this one showed up. I only know he did. But what happened next completely changed everything I thought I knew about my own children. 2 nights later, Claire showed up at my door without calling first. She does that. She took one look at my face and knew something was wrong before I said a word. What happened? I told her everything. The diagnosis, the $8,000, the call to her brother. She didn't say anything for a second, just stood there in my kitchen, jaw working the way it does when she's holding back something about a patient's family. Then she pulled out her phone, opened her banking app and started typing. Claire, don't. I sold the Civic this morning. Casual, like it was nothing, like she hadn't just given up her only car. I've been taking the bus to work for 2 days. I already had savings, and between the two I've got $6,000 for you right now. I can't take your car money. You didn't take it. I'm giving it. She looked up at me, and for a second she looked exactly like her mother had the day she told off a contractor who tried to lowball me on a job 20 years back. You've spent your whole life making sure I had what I needed. Let me do this one thing. $6,000. $2,000 short of what the hospital needed. I sat in my kitchen and looked at my daughter, who had just sold her car to help pay for an operation her brother wouldn't touch with his $12 million fund, and something in me went very, very quiet. I didn't know it yet, but that moment in my kitchen was the last time in this story I'd feel like the poorest man in the room. The remaining $2,000, I found the way I found most things in my life, the hard way. I liquidated what was left of that small emergency account, sold a set of roofing tools I hadn't touched in 3 years to a younger guy starting his own crew. By that Friday, I walked into Desert View Medical Center's billing office and handed Carla Jennings a cashier's check for $8,000. We'll get you scheduled, she told me, and for the first time in 2 weeks, I let myself breathe. Surgery was set for the following Monday. Claire took 2 days off to sit with me before and after, which for a hospice nurse who spends her whole professional life sitting with people through the hardest parts of their lives is saying something about how she felt about this one. I won't drag you through every hour of that hospital stay. I'll just tell you it was long, that ceiling tiles start to look the same after enough hours staring at them, and that the first face I saw when the anesthesia wore off was my daughter's. Sitting in a chair she'd pulled right up next to the bed, holding my hand like she thought I might float away if she let go. Marcus called once the day after surgery, 4 minutes, mostly small talk. He asked if I was doing okay. He didn't ask about the money again, and neither did I. There's only so many times a man can hear no before he stops asking the question. I'm not going to tell you I wasn't angry. I was. But anger's a strange thing to carry into a hospital bed. It doesn't have anywhere to go. It just sits on your chest next to everything else that hurts. Recovery took about 2 weeks. Claire checked on me every day, sometimes before her shift, sometimes after, always with food, always with that same stubborn look that told me arguing was pointless. By the second week, I was back to mostly myself, a little slower on the stairs, a cough that had finally quieted down, and a strange, restless energy I didn't know what to do with. I started walking the block in the mornings before the heat got unbearable, past the same saguaros I'd been looking at my whole life, past the house where Marisol Vega still left tamales on my porch every other week like clockwork. It was on one of those mornings, a Monday, that I found an envelope in my mailbox that didn't look like the usual bills. Heavy paper. A return address I didn't recognize at first. Talon Ridge Holdings, with a Denver address underneath. Talon Ridge. That name again. The same name my son had said into a camera at a bar 6 weeks earlier, like it was the best thing that ever happened to him. I opened it standing right there at the mailbox, and I read it twice because I didn't believe it the first time. If I had known what was coming, I might have braced myself. Instead, it hit me standing in the street with the mail still in my hand. It was from an attorney representing Talon Ridge Holdings, informing me that as a minority equity holder in Desert Sky Roofing and Supply, the company I'd worked for the better part of 24 years, the company I'd quietly bought into back in 2005 when the owner, an old-timer named Walt Ferris, offered his longtime foreman a small stake instead of a raise he couldn't afford to give. The recent acquisition of Desert Sky by Talon Ridge Holdings had triggered a payout on my ownership position. I stood there in the heat, holding a letter that said, in language dry enough to make a lawyer proud, that I was owed just over $1.8 million. I need you to understand what that meant. 20 years ago, Walt couldn't afford to pay me what a foreman with my experience was worth. He offered me 8% of the company instead, a piece of paper that felt like nothing at the time. I could have cashed out plenty of times over the years. I never did. I kept reinvesting my share back into the business instead of drawing it out, because some stubborn part of me believed in that little roofing company more than I believed in my own bank account. That's why I never had much cash sitting around. It wasn't because I didn't have anything. It was because everything I had was tied up somewhere nobody could see it. I hadn't talked to Walt in almost 2 years. He'd retired to a little town called Green Hollow, about 30 minutes south, and we'd fallen out of the habit of calling. I drove down there that same afternoon, letter in hand, half convinced there'd been some kind of mistake. Walt was sitting on his back patio when I pulled in, looking older than I remembered, but he grinned the second he saw me climbing out of my truck. Daniel Kirby. Wondered when you'd show up. He waved at the letter I was still holding, like he already knew what it said. Talon Ridge came in with an offer 8 months ago. Best thing that ever happened to that company. This letter says $1.8 million, Walt. Sounds about right, knowing what your stake had grown to. Casual. Like we were talking about the weather, instead of a number that had just rearranged my entire life. You never took a dime out in 20 years, Daniel. That's compound growth for you. I tried calling to tell you about the deal closing, but your number had changed. It hadn't changed. I just hadn't answered a Denver area code in months, figuring it was a robocall. I sat with Walt a long while that evening, and he told me something that made the whole thing land even heavier. The firm that had brokered the acquisition, handled the financing, ran the whole deal, was a private equity advisory shop out of Denver called Whitmore Capital Partners. I want you to sit with that the way I had to sit with it on Walt's back patio, because it took me a solid minute to understand what he just told me. Whitmore Capital Partners. The same firm my son worked for. The same $12 million deal he'd called me from a bar to celebrate. The deal he'd sworn had no money left over for me was the very deal that had just made me a millionaire. I drove home that night with the windows down, the desert finally cooling off the way it does once the sun's good and gone, and I didn't say a word to anybody for 2 days. I needed to think. Here's the thing I want you to understand about me, because it matters for what comes next. I didn't sit on that money to punish anybody. I sat on it because I needed time to think clearly about what I wanted it to mean, and clear thinking has never happened fast for me. I called Claire first, not to tell her about the money, just to see her. She came over that Wednesday with a bag of groceries she absolutely did not need to buy on a hospice nurse's salary. While she was putting things away, I finally told her. She set down a carton of eggs very slowly, like her hands needed a second to catch up with what her ears had just heard. $1.8 million. A little over from what the attorney's saying. There's still some legal work to finalize it into a trust. Dad, her voice cracked. A month ago you were down to your last $2,100, and I was selling my car to cover a hospital deposit. That's right. I reached across the table and took her hand, the same hand that had held mine in that recovery room. You sold your car for me, Claire. You took the bus to work for 2 weeks so I could get on an operating table. I've thought about this every day for the last 2 days, and I want you to hear me say it plain. This money is going to you, all of it. Dad, no, that's not. It's already decided. I met with an attorney yesterday. The trust is being drawn up right now, and it's irrevocable once it's signed. Every dollar. She cried right there in my kitchen. The kind of crying that comes from somewhere deeper than the number itself. I held on to her and thought about her mother, and how proud Diane would have been of the woman our daughter had turned into. I didn't know it yet, but word travels fast in a family, even through people who aren't supposed to be talking to each other anymore. The trust finalized on a Monday in late July. I paid off Claire's payday loan in full. She'd taken one out at a punishing interest rate to help cover some of my hospital costs on top of the $6,000 she'd already given me. Something she hadn't even told me about until the attorney's paperwork surfaced it. I cleared the remaining balance on her apartment lease. I set aside a chunk to help her start the tutoring program for underprivileged kids she'd been talking about for 2 years, but never had the capital to launch. And I bought her a car, nothing flashy, just something reliable that wouldn't leave her stranded at a bus stop at 6 in the morning ever again. None of that was public information. None of it should have been anybody's business but ours. But Whitmore Capital Partners handles the cap table for every deal it closes, and somewhere in the back office of that Denver firm, on a Wednesday morning about 10 days after the trust finalized, somebody ran a routine post-close ownership report on the Desert Sky roofing acquisition, and my name came up as the single largest individual payout on the entire deal. I imagine it took about 30 seconds for that report to land on the desk of a junior associate. I imagine it took another 30 seconds for that associate to say my last name out loud in an open office where my son happened to be sitting. At this point, I thought the worst of it was already behind me. I was wrong. Marcus showed up at my door on a Wednesday evening, 3 days after that report must have crossed somebody's desk. He didn't call first. He didn't knock the way a guest knocks. He pounded on the door hard enough that I heard it from the kitchen. I opened it, and my son was standing on my porch in a suit that probably cost more than my truck, face red, jaw set in a way that reminded me painfully of myself in my worst moments. "You want to explain to me," he started before I'd even gotten the door fully open, "why my father's name is on a cap table for a deal I closed? Come in, Marcus." "No, I want an answer right now." $1.8 million, Dad. You've had 8% of Desert Sky this whole time, and you never once mentioned it. Not when I was in college taking out loans. Not when you called me crying for $8,000 for surgery. I wasn't crying. And watch how you talk to me in my own house. He pushed past me into the kitchen anyway, and I let him, because some part of me knew this conversation was coming and there wasn't any avoiding it. You let me sit there and refuse you. You let me think I was the bad guy for not bailing out a father who apparently had almost $2 million sitting in equity this entire time. I didn't have it, Marcus. Not when you and I talked on the phone. The deal hadn't closed yet. I found out about the payout 2 weeks after my surgery from a letter in my mailbox. Same as anybody else would have. Convenient timing. It's not convenient, it's the truth. Sit down. He didn't sit. He stood there in the middle of my kitchen, the same kitchen where Claire had slid an envelope of cash across the table for me a month earlier, and I watched something ugly move across his face. "So where's my share?" There it was. Not "Are you okay, Dad?" Not "I'm sorry about what I said on the phone. Where's my share?" There isn't one. Excuse me. The trust is already finalized, Marcus. Irrevocable. Every dollar of that payout went to your sister. His face went a color I'd never seen on him before. You gave all of it to Claire. She sold her car for me. She emptied her savings. She took out a payday loan at an interest rate that should be illegal so I could get on an operating table, and she never once asked me for anything in return. You told me there was no money for me, and then you asked me for a share of money you didn't even know existed a week ago. Do you hear yourself? That money should have been split between us. I'm your son. You are my son. You'll always be my son. But being my son isn't the same as earning anything, Marcus. And I think somewhere in that firm, around all those closing dinners and champagne toasts, you forgot the difference. He slammed his hand flat on my kitchen table. A gesture I'd have expected from a man twice as desperate as him. You're going to regret this. This family is going to fall apart over your pride. This family already fell apart, son. It fell apart the night you told me there was no money for me and went back to your party. I just didn't say it out loud until right now. Nobody said anything for a long moment. Outside, I could hear the first real thunder of the season rolling in off the mountains, the kind of storm the whole city had been waiting on for 2 straight months, finally arriving right when nobody expected it. I needed help, quieter now, because there wasn't any anger left in me for shouting. I called you first, Marcus, before I called your sister, before I called anybody. I called you because you're my son, and some part of me still believed you'd show up. You didn't. Claire did. That's not me being petty. That's just what happened. He stood there another few seconds, jaw working, staring at me like he was trying to find an argument that would land. He didn't find one. Get out of my house, Marcus. He left without another word, and I heard his car peel out of the driveway hard enough to leave a mark on the asphalt. I sat down at my kitchen table alone, listening to that storm finally break, rain hitting a roof I hadn't climbed in years. Thinking about Walt Ferris offering a stubborn young foreman 8% of a company instead of a raise he couldn't afford, and how neither one of us had any idea what that piece of paper would turn into 20 years down the line. Claire called the next morning. She'd already heard from a mutual friend that Marcus had shown up furious, and she wanted to check on me the way she checks on everyone, gently, like she was afraid I might break. He's not going to forgive you for this. I know. Are you okay with that? I thought about it a long moment, watching the last of the storm clouds drift east over the mountains. Everything outside my window, finally green after 2 months of dust. I called him first, baby. When I needed help, I called your brother first. He told me no. You showed up with $6,000 and a car you sold without blinking. I don't need Marcus to forgive me for giving that money to the person who actually earned it. I need him to understand it. Those aren't the same thing, and I've made my peace with which one I'm going to get. She was quiet for a second. I love you, Dad. I love you too, baby. Now get some rest. You've got patients tomorrow who need you a lot more than I do right now. I hung up the phone and sat on my porch a while, watching the water run down the street the way it does after a real desert storm, cutting little rivers through the dust that had been sitting there for months, waiting for exactly this. Somewhere across town, my son was probably explaining to somebody at that firm why the biggest payout on his own deal had gone to a family he'd walked away from. Somewhere closer, my daughter was probably already asleep, worn out from a day spent sitting with somebody else's family through somebody else's hardest hour, the way she always does. The way she always has. 20 years ago, I took 8% of a roofing company instead of a raise. I needed a lot more at the time. It turned out to be the best deal I ever made, not because of the money, but because it taught me, all these years later, exactly who was going to show up when I had nothing left to offer anybody, and who was only ever going to show up for the numbers. I know which one of my kids I'd hand my last $2,100 to again if I had to do it all over, and I know which one I wouldn't. So let me ask you something before you go. If you were in my position, would you have made the same choice? Would you have handed everything to the child who showed up, or tried to find some way to hold the family together anyway. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from tonight and what you would have done in my shoes. If this story meant something to you, hit like, subscribe, and share it with somebody who needs to hear it. Thank you for sitting with me through this one. I'll see you in the next story.